webinar for today. This webinar will be recorded. Everyone is on mute at the moment. I'm Ira Feldman. I'm the Managing Director of the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium and a member of the AASHE Advisory Council. I'm serving as the webinar organizer today along with Tom Bauman of Interactive Leader, who is also a Sustainability Curriculum Consortium Advisory Council member. Thanks to the many who are joining us today for the second webinar in our Pedagogy series. We are delighted by the overwhelmingly positive announcement of this SCC-AASHE collaboration, and once again we expect to have a full house today on the webinar. As you know, this is a 4-webinar series. We got off to a great start last week with Susan Santone. Today, Jess Gerrior is the session leader. Jess will again lead on July 12th, and then Susan Santone will conclude the series on July 19th. All of our sessions are on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Before each webinar, you'll receive an email with new logon information before each webinar. And yes, your colleagues can still register for the remaining webinars, so please do share our announcement with your networks. All the webinars are being recorded. Links to the recordings of these webinars will be posted on both the SCC and AASHE websites. Additionally, everyone registered for the webinar series should have already received a link to the first webinar recording via email. We sent that out in the last 24 hours. Regarding AASHE, the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium is an AASHE member organization. We are not a program that's part of AASHE, but we are proud to be partnering with AASHE in delivering this Pedagogy webinar series. We expect that this collaboration will lead to further collaboration with our friends at AASHE. Special mention goes to Julian Dotremont-Smith and Dieter Sergi for their efforts in coordinating this webinar series. As for the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium, if this is your first introduction to us, please know that we expect to proceed in supporting college and university teaching faculty and education for sustainability and sustainable development with a range of activities, including our next online dialogue, which will focus on the several components of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Pre-registration for that online dialogue series is now open. Please check out our website. The Sustainability Curriculum Consortium website is curriculumforsustainability.com, curriculumforsustainability.com. On the website, you'll find more details on our mission, our partners, and our various upcoming planned programs. We want to be responsive to your needs, the needs of sustainability educators at the university and college level. So we are always interested in your thoughts on 2 questions. What are your biggest challenges in teaching sustainability? And what are your greatest needs to successfully prepare the next generation of sustainability leaders? Today's webinar is titled Language and Inclusion, Educational Leadership Practices that Enhance Learners' Sense of Ecological Identity and Efficacy. Jess Gerrior will lead this session on how sustainability conversations begin, who is invited to the table, and who is left out can determine how learners identify with and feel motivated to take on the broad issue of sustainability. And this includes faculty, students, and other members of learning organizations. Sustainability leaders know that it is about more than environmental problem solving, that generating momentum for sustainable change involves difficult social, economic, and political conversations. Jess will explore with you What models and methods can educators use to create inviting spaces for learners to develop new and deeper connections to sustainability? Before I hand things over to today's webinar presenter, Jess Gerrior, for those of you not already familiar with her and her work, let me just say a few quick words. Jess is the Director of Learning and Practice for the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. She is presently a PhD Fellow at the Antioch University, New England. Jess has over 15 years experience in higher education, most recently as Sustainability Coordinator and Educator at Franklin Pierce University, where she oversaw the Sustainability Center and the Sustainability Certificate Program. In addition to great recognition for her professional work, all of that is detailed on our SCC website, Jess has served as chair of the Monadnock Farm and Community Coalition, project manager for the Monadnock Food Co-op, and as a volunteer for several organizations devoted to issues of food security, community resilience, and the environment. And last but not least, Jess is a leader of the Monadnock Roller Derby. As Jess is conducting her presentation and you have questions that come up, please send them in to us. Tom and I will be reviewing the incoming questions and we will include them in Jess's Q&A sessions. With that, I'm happy to present my friend and colleague, Jess Gerrior.
Thank you so much, Ira. And Ira and Tom, just want to check that you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here on this beautiful summer day. I will acknowledge that as sustainability practitioners and educators and writers and creative people, that we all have multiple roles, multiple challenges, multiple opportunities within our organization, and there are many ways that you could have spent this afternoon. So I want to express on behalf of Ira as well our gratitude for your partaking in today's webinar, and also reiterate what Ira has said about our gratitude for this response. It's been very interesting to me as a researcher and a learner, as well as a sustainability educator, to see the amount of interest that there is in this particular topic in sustainability pedagogy. And I think that's a really, just this, this webinar alone is an indicator of what's out there in terms of interest and passion for this topic. So thank you for being here. I want to talk about the word sustainability to start off with, and some of you will hopefully find this a little bit humorous. I tend to keep things a little bit less formal in my webinars as well as in my teaching, so just to set everyone at ease, a little bit of sustainability humor. So as you have probably found in your own practice, whether you are working as a teaching faculty at a university or in an educational role in another capacity, people use the word sustainability a lot. They use it in popular media, they use it in the classroom, they use it in textbooks, they use it in promotional materials for universities and every kind of organization. And it's a watchword, it's jargon, it's a theme, it's a slogan, it's all of the above. And while I don't think that anyone would criticize the use of sustainability in any of those places as it's appropriate, it does receive some criticism. As Fortune and Hughes have said, it's an empty concept, lacking firm substance and containing embedded ideological positions that are, under the best interpretations, condescending and paternalistic. And yet, at the same time, everyone agrees that sustainability is a good thing. So, just right off the bat, identifying that this is a tricky word, and that teaching about such a tricky word is just not impossible by any means, but it is really tricky. Especially knowing that learners, whether they are educators, undergraduates, graduate students, administrators, wherever they are in their learning process, everyone comes to this conversation with their own meanings and assumptions. So as far as the intended outcomes for your learning and your practice out of this webinar, I hope that together we can develop an awareness of how participation, learning, and outcomes in education for sustainable development and education for sustainability can be influenced by the language that we use around it. I hope that together we can identify some opportunities to create learning environments where all those different ways of knowing and all those different ways of working are valued as well as practiced. And third, that we'll together consider sustainability education as leadership. You may or may not think of your own educational practice, whatever that looks like for you, as a form of leadership. But I hope that by the end of this webinar you'll start to think about it that way at least. And specifically with regard to curriculum development, perhaps consider that as a leadership practice. So why this topic? Sustainability, very broad. Narrowing it down to sustainability education, still very, very broad. Sustainability pedagogy, again, depending on what discipline, what academic culture, what geography, what language or identity you're coming to this table with, all of those are very, very broad topics. I felt in developing the topic for this particular webinar series that the emphasis on transdisciplinary thinking and on systems thinking with regard to sustainability problems cannot be overemphasized. And a couple of assumptions that I put into developing this topic as well. How we talk shapes how we think, and vice versa. Language is important in conveying an idea, certainly. Words are like boxes for ideas, if you want to think of them that way. And how we contain those ideas and convey them to others and share them and take them apart and put them back together again all revolves around the particular terms and phrases and themes that we're using in our language. So that matters. The interesting thing about what we talk about as well as how we talk about it is that it's an indicator of what we value. If you were to do an anthropological study of sustainability educators, for example, you could tell what they value based on what they write, what they convey in the classroom through speech and other forms of communication, right? So what we talk about identifies what we value. How we talk also influences who identifies with that conversation and where they sense their role at the table. And this is a key theme that I hope that you'll see throughout this webinar and in your own work as well, which I hope you'll share during the interactive part of the webinar. Depending on what terms you're using and what framings you're using to create a conversation, and you probably have found this in your own experience as well, you'll turn people right onto a topic or turn people right off of a topic with the same word. Sustainability is one of those words. And who comes to the table really matters. If you have been part of a group of any kind, centered around a goal of any kind, you know that who comes to the table can really influence the direction that that work goes. So in preparing for the webinar today, very timely article just came out this morning. It's actually a republishing of an article originally published in The Great Transition. If you're not already familiar with Resilience, the journal, I recommend it. It's got very good writing by some really interesting authors. Just came out with an article today about the role of higher education and the greater purpose that it has. I pulled out one particular quote, which I'll just summarize here, that there is a radical shift going on at different rates in different places, of course, but it is happening. And teaching learners, especially in higher education, how to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity in a volatile world means helping students not just to collect information, not just to help them develop a portfolio of knowledge and skills, which is important, but also to learn to find that knowledge for themselves and to apply that knowledge from all different sources, be they books, media, their own experience, collaborations, etc., and from all different cultural backgrounds to understand all of these complex problems. And it means showing students how to integrate those feelings, those values, and emotions with facts. And humanities are essential to that. So, to go over the agenda for today, at least the order of things, we can spend more or less time on a particular topic depending on feedback that you might have as participants in the discussion. And if you do have those pieces of feedback, please do put them, as Ira mentioned, into the chat box. I'm going to reintroduce some participant questions here and invite you to reflect on those questions as we move through the slides in the webinar. Hopefully you've received those questions in the message that went out before today's session. You may or may not have had a chance to really reflect on them, and please feel that you don't feel that you have to have ready answers in order to participate in the discussion today. Feel free to carry those questions forward beyond this webinar into your own practice afterwards. But I did want to provide those questions so you have a chance at least to just start thinking about some of these themes here. I'll talk a little bit about my experiences, my assumptions, and my motivations as a sustainability educator, and sort of what I'm bringing to the pedagogy equation, including lots of questions that I have that I'm always working on. I'll provide a couple of working definitions. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that sustainability can be a tricky word. There are other tricky words embedded in here, embedded in anything that you might read about sustainability, in fact. And so just a couple of words that I felt were worth defining here for the purposes of this session. I'll offer a couple of case studies from teaching and practice, and depending on how much time is available and how many questions we have from you, the participants, we could just mention those briefly, or we could go into a lot of detail or come back around to them. But the important part for me to be able to provide to you here today is an opportunity to exchange your knowledge and skills with one another as much as possible. Because we know that, first of all, I am not the expert on sustainability pedagogy. I think we all are experts in our own right and our own experience, but I know that there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom out there among you as well. So I want to make sure that we have a chance to exchange those. The other thing that I hope will be valuable to you is that I'll provide some resources and recommendations for cultivating your own sustainability education practice that is inclusive, that is mindful of language that we use around these very broad, very deep, very messy topics. These are some resources that I have used in my own practice and those that have been recommended to me by others. And vetted with other educators and administrators that I've worked with. And then lastly, that I hope will also be very valuable to you to take with you beyond this webinar are some reflection questions that you can use to develop a more inclusive practice of sustainability education. Lastly, some suggestions for feedback loops. Feedback is of course, an integral part of sustainable systems, having those feedback loops. And they're very important to me as an educator to have continual feedback, to always be receiving information back to me about what is helpful and what is not helpful and what can be used to improve. So please stay to the very end. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? If so, please go ahead and put those into the chat box, and Ira and Tom can help facilitate asking those questions. Okay, so the first question for participants, just to review, in case you didn't get a chance to look at these earlier, is think back to a moment when you became aware that you were involved in education for sustainability. I'm guessing that most of you did not start out your school career when you were 4 or 5 years old saying, I am going to be involved in sustainability education. There was a point somewhere in your professional development when you realized that you identified with this education for sustainability topic. Or perhaps you're just developing that awareness right now. Perhaps you're simply curious about this topic, that you don't necessarily consider yourself involved in education for sustainability, but you're curious about it and you might be developing that awareness now. So what are the projects, what are the people, what are the titles, what are the goals, those kinds of words and phrases that you might identify as the hooks. Well, what drew you into those kinds of conversations? Think about what those conversation topics were. Second question is, think back to some experience you've had involving education for sustainability. It might be a lesson you were working on. It might be a project you were involved in. It might be one of those hallway conversations or one of those big boring meetings that you have to go to. And it's around this topic of education for sustainability, and it just did not, for whatever reason, go as well as you might have developed. Think back on that experience and ask yourself, what was the goal there? Who was trying to sell this idea, this goal, and what influence do you think that language that was built around that experience, how people talked about it, what they said and how they said it, and who they said it to, had on the outcome of that project? And then third question to think about, and again in no particular order, and for some of you these questions might run together, but what challenges do you face as a sustainability educator in terms of building a learning environment that actually is inclusive, that does welcome all different ways of speaking and knowing? And what questions do you have about what you're going to do about those challenges, given that you have experiences of your own, you have assumptions of your own, you have motivations of your own? Okay. And again, just one more reminder, if you do have any questions that come up or comments that you want to add, just go ahead and put those into the chat box. So, speaking of experiences and assumptions and motivations, I think it's only right to introduce myself and kind of where I'm coming from. I am an environmental educator. I have a master's degree in environmental studies with a concentration in environmental educator. And I have filled that role in both formal and non-formal ways. I'm a former sustainability coordinator, as Ira mentioned, with Franklin Pierce University, and helped develop the Sustainability Certificate Program, which is an undergraduate program that works a little bit like a minor, but can be done in addition to a minor. I'm currently a doctoral fellow at Antioch University, New England. I am a former board officer and current member of Monadnock Farm and Community Coalition, and have spent a number of years now thinking about, as well as smelling, touching, and tasting local food, and thinking about deep questions about what this local food thing has to do with the broader pictures of economic, ecological, and social sustainability. I am an AASHE volunteer. I volunteered at conferences. I've been on the advisory council and was involved with the listening project. And another part of my identity is as a parent. I think about the current time and the future time quite a lot, and have the kinds of senses of responsibility and fear and hope that all of you here today who are parents can identify with. Other parts of my experience, biophilia. I grew up loving nature. That's part of my experience coming in as an educator. I haven't been always aware of how that love of nature comes through when I'm speaking and interacting with people, but part of my education practice is to be reflective about who I am and where I come from, so I list that among my motivations for doing this work. I went to a public school in a town that did not have a terrible amount of money. When I became a parent, I really became very aware of things like peak oil and food prices and scarcity, and that motivated me to enter into a graduate program where I could develop skills to perhaps help the world in some way with regard to those issues. I'm motivated by things like questions about resilience, livelihood, and community. Some of my travels that have motivated me in this work are to Iquitos, Peru, to the International Association of Universities International Conference in 2014, which I would be happy to share with you if people have questions about that, as well as to the On Sustainability Knowledge Network conference in Portland, Oregon, and AASHE's conference in Portland, Oregon a couple of years ago. I'm really interested in the ways that things are interconnected and interdependent, and how people learn about these larger sustainability issues, especially through gardening and local food systems. So that's who I am and where I come from. And again, with regard to the session topic, I know that I need to understand that other people orient to these issues of sustainability and education for sustainability have different experiences from mine, and are motivated by different things. And that comes through in our language. We'll get more into that a little bit later in the session. Okay. So a couple of working definitions. I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar that we would tackle some of these tricky words just so we are a little bit, kinda, sorta on the same page. I say a little bit, kinda, sorta with regard to sustainability because as you may know, depending on how long you've been in this field, there is no one universally held definition of sustainability, and it is not the position of the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium necessarily to come up with that definition. We are here to support educators in higher education to develop their professional practice, to help educators define what resources and programs are most needed and valuable to them in developing that practice. But what we do want to emphasize is that while there is no one universal definition of sustainability, it is definitely about beyond going green. We want to really emphasize that point that although sustainability can easily be lumped in with the environmental sciences, and you've probably all worked with audiences that when you say sustainability, first thing that comes to mind is recycling, going organic, going green, saving energy. And sustainability certainly does encompass those, but it doesn't, those definitions don't go far enough to address the underlying economic, social, political issues that sustainability also entails. I mentioned ecology, economy, and equity, the three basic E's of sustainability. This isn't necessarily meant to be a Sustainability 101, so I won't go into the details too far there, but I'll also introduce this term Ubuntu. From African tradition, it means I am who I am because we are who we are. It's a short one-word box for an idea that means we are all interconnected and we all bring value to the whole. The last little item is a quote from Peter Senge's book to identify that sustainability and systems go together. So if you're talking about something that's sustainable, what is that something that you are describing as sustainable? Is it a planet? Is it a society? A sustainable system is what you're talking about. So these are a whole something, right? A social ecological system that includes people, other living organisms, and the matter and energy that make them up. That's organized in some way. And depending on how you're perceiving that whole, you are the observer. The structure of the system includes you as the observer as well. If there are any questions so far, just go ahead and put them in the chat box. I also want to define what I mean by inclusive. I'm talking about what voices are being heard and who's not, whose framing is being employed, who's invited to the conversation, who's actually engaged, and who's listening. When I talk about learners, I don't necessarily only mean undergraduate students sitting in a classroom. That might be the first definition that comes to mind. But you here who are coming to the webinar are also learners. You are educators, you're researchers, you're leaders. Basically by learner, I mean everyone. And curriculum, when we talk about curriculum, sort of what we teach, but I want to mention that that includes what we intentionally teach, the overt curriculum, as in what we cover in our syllabi and our lesson plans, as well as what we unintentionally or covertly teach through our campus buildings and our campus plan, through the ways that we feed ourselves, transport, and clothe ourselves, all of those things that might not be explicit but are taught nonetheless. Hopefully curricula is supported by research and experience. Hopefully curricula is responsive to the needs of the learners. But an important point here that all curriculum exists in some kind of a context. What we teach and how we teach it is definitely influenced by the social and environmental and political contexts in which we teach. And just to be mindful of that. And then also when I talk about leadership, I'm talking about the characteristics of a person who is influencing the sustainability conversation in some way. Leadership in this context, I believe, involves some cultural competency, being able to bridge the disciplines, to bridge the roles within an institution. And leadership involves the willingness to both promote change and to be change. Leadership involves helping people to have a sense of agency and efficacy, and it's often the leaders within an organization that cultivate hope. At this point, I want to just mention that I do have some case studies that I can go into, but I also want to be mindful of the time as it's about 2:40, and I want to make sure that any participants who have questions to ask are going to be able to answer them. So for the time being, I'm actually going to skip over these particular case studies, which are just here for example, and go on to the first of the 3 questions that I introduced in the beginning of the webinar, and invite all of the participants to place in the chat box if they have any desire to participate at this point. Tom and Ira, if you want to let me know if you're seeing any comments come here, show up in the text in the chat box.
Hi Jess, this is Tom. I am just realizing that there are some participants using the questions option or tool in contrast to using the chat tool, and so we're starting to see some questions being posted there. It's preferable to use the chat option going forward so we don't miss any points, but I am able to see so the participants aren't able to see the chat tool. I just saw a point. So thank you for letting us know. So I'll convey some questions to you right now, Jess.
Great, thank you.
Okay. My intriguing first awareness was over 25 years ago from the field of hardwood flooring when clients were experiencing mysterious flaws in the wood they were receiving, reflected in the forests when the air quality was determined to be the perpetrator in toxic chemicals that were in the tree rings. I started with the natural step over 20 years ago as the only Nobel science-vetted framework is the only framework that hangs together. And I'll give you just one other. I'm also currently finishing a global EE program at Cornell with 3,200 students from 120 countries to hang together in the way you've defined. So those are more comments. And then finally, the hook for me was interconnectedness. I love that others realize that ecology is connected to economy and society and vice versa. That's it for now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom, for passing those along, and thank you to the participants who brought those forward. I especially am very fond of that last term, interconnectedness, and I think that if I had to take on this assignment, so to speak, I think that interconnectedness would probably be one of those words or phrases that hooked me into this sustainability education practice. The interconnectedness of our food is a really easy one for me to go into. I will circle back around to the case studies and talk a little bit more about food, or a lot more about food if participants would like, because that is definitely a topic that I could spend a lot of time talking about. But the the nutritional quality of the food alone, if you want to just look at the parts and pieces of what food actually is materially made of, how that's interconnected with the soil quality and the microorganisms that live in that soil, and the process by which they got there, the history of the land itself, how people have used that land, the stories that go along with that, and then of course the enjoyment and sharing and traditions that come out of growing, sharing, and celebrating with food. That's a great way to illustrate this point of interconnectedness. So as other people think of those words, phrases, and themes, feel free to grab a piece of paper or open up another window on your computer and think about what those words and phrases are, because chances are, if those are some of the words that have hooked you, those could be your opportunities to hook others who are interested in the same kinds of concepts, who may or may not actually be aware that they are talking about sustainability, but in fact are. So for the next question that I invited everyone to think about is think about some experience involving education for sustainability, be it a conversation, a project you worked on, etc., that didn't go as well as you had hoped. Who identified that goal and what did they say about it or talk about it or ask about it that for whatever reason had some kind of an outcome on that project, that maybe somebody was excluded and it had a detrimental effect on how that came out. How do you suppose that language or that phrasing influenced that work? Tom, do you have any questions from participants on that second question?
Are you aware that all 9 of the planetary boundaries are related to food as a source of living energy?
What an interesting question. No, I had not heard of that. I would love for the participant who submitted that question to perhaps email us and say a little bit more about that. That is a stellar example of interconnectedness. I would definitely want to hear more about that.
Another comment related to interconnectedness. For me, as someone from a minority-serving institution, hooks have been injustice, particularly environmental injustice. And the interconnectedness drew us in.
Yes, thank you for that other really, really good, rich word. Injustice can be difficult for a lot of educators to talk about. Speaking from my own experience, and of course if you have differing experiences as participants, feel free to share those as well. But my first background and my first introduction to sustainability was not from the humanities. I did not consider myself a social scientist. I was completely disinterested in political science or economics or any of those things that I just thought were above my head and intangible and therefore not worth studying. I had all these crazy ideas about what was important back then. But more recently, and as I continue to develop as a sustainability educator, I am blown away by how many times I come across an article, a person in my community, a project that in some way, shape, or form comes down to a matter of justice and injustice. Another example of that would be the differences that I saw in the IAU conference that I mentioned in Iquitos, Peru, versus other sustainability-themed conferences that I've been to in North America, certainly not just AASHE conferences, but others that I've been to in New England as well. And the difference in emphasis between environmental technical problem solving versus environmental injustice and disparities in access to food, access to clean water, access to decision making and leadership roles, the role of other kinds of diversity beyond language and academic diversity, women's rights, all kinds of different social measures of injustice. So that's another really tricky one and a hard one for a lot of people, including educators, to be willing to tackle. So thank you for bringing that one up. Okay, so moving on to the third question. What challenges do we face as sustainability educators in terms of building an inclusive, collaborative learning environment? We all have colleagues who, with, again, different backgrounds and assumptions about what sustainability means. So given those differences, how would we like to address those challenges? What questions do we have about that? Do you have some responses for this next question?
Jess, before moving on to the responses for the next question, there was a few that just came in at the end for your previous question, if you'd like me to raise those.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. A comment, I think, helping others recognize when they are already talking or addressing sustainability issues is a real critical piece and helps them bring up more thoughts on how they can integrate more. It stops the mindset of thinking they don't know anything about it or that it's not their responsibility. Next is a question. Can you talk about land use issues regarding environmental constraints versus developers? I don't know if you want to address that before I move on.
Well, first I want to make sure that I understand the question.
Perhaps Lois is able to follow that up, and in the meantime, because I don't have another explanation to offer you at this time.
Okay.
While we're waiting for elaboration, I'll move to the next. That would be the work of Johan Rockstrom, the Stockholm Resilience Center. I missed the first part, which may have had the contact information, such as email, to send the feedback you asked for. And that's from Gerrior. Moving on to the next. Regarding number 2, I have found that not using the term sustainability as a lead-in is a much better approach when dealing with technical folks, i.e. non-environmental engineers and project managers. Sometimes walls go up when this term is used. And then finally, that I see in the questions box right now, a number of faculty at my college are including sustainability in various ways in their classes, but I have had a time getting any faculty to volunteer to help develop a program for sustainability across the curriculum. And then one last one that just came in. I am currently interested in Otto Scharmer's theory U approach, apologies for not knowing what that is, as a way to foster inclusion and collaboration.
All right, thanks, Tom. And again, thank you to the participants here. This is great so far. As I mentioned, one of the intended outcomes for this is that you would have an opportunity to share your wisdom and experience with others. So I'm already learning a lot from you about your experiences and different ways of thinking about things. I want to encourage you to continue that conversation beyond the webinar that we're participating in right now. 2 of the points that really stand out for me, one is about walls going up, not leading in to the conversation with that term sustainability because of those walls that just go right up. And it takes a little bit of learning there, and sometimes the learning can be rather difficult at times. Again, speaking from experience, to see that other people just don't want to hear that word because they sense that they're going to be held liable for something, that they are being asked to do something, that by embracing this idea that they're aligning themselves somehow with a political or social cause that they may or may not feel comfortable doing, when in fact you may actually be more on the same page than you think. And then the other part was the participant who was having a hard time getting anybody on board with helping to develop sustainability across the curriculum. This was brought up at the On Sustainability Knowledge Network in Portland this past January in a couple of different ways, and part of it was really really challenging to listen to, because you hear so much frustration in the voices of educators who are trying to do this, who are not necessarily getting help from their administrators, who are not even able to find, let alone engage, anybody who's interested and on board with this idea of cross-curricular sustainability efforts. But as difficult as it is, it's also quite hopeful, and I'm thinking of one of the resources that I will share toward the end of the webinar that lists examples of how that is happening. And so I would want to encourage that anyone here or any of your colleagues that you know of who are doing that kind of work and finding even small successes in doing that, whether it's a sustainability certificate type program or whether it's co-teaching or any of the creative ideas that I've seen in the literature, go ahead and publish those in some way, shape, or form and share them with others, be it in a journal or talk like these. Give other people hope that those kinds of things can be done, because the more examples we have of that, the more that effort's going to continue to grow. So thank you for the questions. At this point,
follow up.
I'm going to go back to the I'm sorry, go ahead, Tom.
I'm sorry, just to interrupt you. I just wanted to inform you that there is a follow-up to the previous question in which you had stated you weren't clear on and wanted some elaboration.
Yes.
And so the original question, just to give that reminder, is, sorry, going through quite a few questions here at the moment. Where is it? I can't find the original question. It was related to land use, and the example is new campus construction in sensitive areas, getting administrators to think in terms of sustainable landscape practices outside their LEED certified buildings.
Okay, so the original question was asking about, I see the follow-up now, about new campus construction in sensitive areas. So the original question was to ask how we can educate administrators on the different factors involved in those decisions.
The original question was, can you talk about land use issues regarding environmental constraints versus developers?
Okay. For me, I guess I would say that I would not consider myself an expert in decision making around land use development and getting beyond LEED certified, except to say that for working with administrators who are very conscientious people who are doing such hard work in trying to bridge together campus operations and facilities and academics and promoting their organization and making sure that they're delivering an excellent education, both in terms of the prescribed curricula and in terms of the physical environment, which again is part of the covert curricula. It's a way that people learn what that university is about, right? What they see, where they walk, how they transport themselves, what the buildings speak to, what the buildings speak of. It's all part of the educational whole, right? I think that I could speak more to opportunities for student learning in connection with those kinds of projects. A big part of what I have done with the Sustainability Certificate Program is helping students to identify what their learning and professional goals are and crafting a semester-long sustainability project around those. Many of those projects had to do with greening buildings, doing research on the costs and benefits of using this particular piece of land versus that particular piece of land, doing a species inventory, doing water quality assessments and those kinds of things to help with decision making. So while I could speak more to how that program was developed and some of the benefits for students, I think it's probably a little bit outside of the scope of what SCC does and what I'm doing as a sustainability educator and learner currently. However, there are, again, some good resources on that, some of which we'll probably talk about at the end of the webinar. And if others here have good resources for that participant question, feel free to get in touch separately. So, okay. So, I'm going to take a couple of steps back here and realizing that we do have a little bit of time to go into at least one case study here from teaching and practice. And again, the emphasis here is on language and inclusion, how we talk about sustainability in higher education in a way that doesn't immediately turn people off, in a way that does communicate that there's a role for everyone and an entry point for everyone. Excuse me. I could talk about the Workplace Organic Gardens, which is the foundation of my current doctoral fellowship. Excuse me one moment. So I'll describe the project first, and I can speak a little bit to that theme of language. Actually, before I move on, I do have to take a pause. So Ira, I'll ask you to take over for just one moment.
Hi, while Jess is catching her breath, this is Ira. I hope you can hear me. This may be a good time to jump in and say a word for our co-sponsors, our friends at AASHE. I was going to speak about AASHE activities at the end of the webinar, but this will give Jess a couple of minutes to recover. First of all, I want to again thank both Julian and Dita for their support of this collaboration on the webinar series. There are two AASHE activities that I want to highlight today. One, which is directly relevant to what was just being discussed in Jess's presentation, is to make sure that everyone on the line is aware of AASHE's still relatively new Campus Sustainability Hub, which is an online resource. It's available at hub.aashe.org, and it's basically a toolbox and resource collection covering all aspects of sustainability in higher education, in other words, not limited to curriculum and faculty development. There's a wealth of information to be found there, a great resource. Also, I want to put a plug in for AASHE's showcase event, the annual AASHE conference. For those of you who are not already registered, the good news is that early bird registration is still available through July 15th. The conference itself will be taking place this year in Baltimore from October 9th through 12th, and the link to the AASHE conference website is simply conference.aashe.org. And so with that, I will check back and see if Jess is in a position to continue.
I'm all set, Ira. Can everyone hear me now? Can you hear me, Ira?
Okay. I hope that AASHE will continue to retain me as their spokesmodel.
Thank you so much, and my apologies to everyone. It was simply a matter of too much dust and pollen in the air, and I just needed to get some more tea. I am all set, and I thank you, Ira, for pitching in and providing that info while I recover. So, okay. Thank you for your patience, everyone. So I was going to talk about a case study, if you will, talking about my own experience at the moment with the workplace organic gardens. And specifically in relation to how we talk about sustainability, which might be different from how others talk about sustainability, and without even using the word sustainability in our everyday conversation, how we are in fact getting to the same thing when we are mindful about using language that is inclusive. So this project provides workplace land for employees to actually grow food in either raised beds or in a plot in a fields, depending on the location of the workplace. And the food is, of course, available for the employee's own use, but what goes along with that is a kind of encouragement and support for employees to bring the fresh organic food that they grow to a local hunger agency, and depending on where the workplace is, this may serve a few people in their community or many more. What makes it interesting in terms of, again, language and inclusion is that for a lot of the gardeners, it's simply about contributing to one's community. Gardening for some of the employees is something that they have done for many years. They're really great at it. They take it very seriously, and this just simply provides them the opportunity to do what they love to do, and as well as contribute back to the community. For others, it's about getting outdoors and living a healthy lifestyle, and all of those kinds of messages that we get about wellness and the importance of taking care of one's physical health through nutrition and exercise and the outdoors. The garden provides a way to achieve that. For some, it is more about the camaraderie of working in a non-work environment with your coworkers, taking community building outside of the cubicle or the work floor or wherever you happen to be, and bringing it into an environment where conversations happen just a little more easily, more naturally. So all of those things, community building, service in volunteerism, health and wellness, exercise, stress relief, all of those kinds of things are part of the whole sustainability picture. So as someone who's involved with the project and helping direct the project and support employees in contributing and participating, I don't necessarily need to go out and say, hey, let's go be sustainable. Let's go do sustainable things in the garden. It doesn't even require that kind of language in order to be inclusive. When I invite someone into the garden to grow tomatoes, tomatoes is the term, right? Tomatoes is that hook. And so that's just one example of teaching and practice from my own experience. Fast forwarding through the other couple of slides, because I do want to make sure that we cover some resources and recommendations as well as the reflection questions that I hope people will find valuable after the webinar. So we've talked about developing an ecological sensibility or an ecological identity and ecological efficacy, but we've also, on the other hand, talked about the fact that sustainability isn't just about the environment. It's not just being a good ecological citizen or being a nature person or being a super recycler. So I point out this resource as a way to clarify that when I say ecological identity, I am talking about the larger sense of community of humans as well as other living things and the land in which we're part. Recognizing that it is interconnected, that it is part of a whole. as far as where people who are developing curriculum and people who are teaching curriculum, this is where the educational practice really hits home, is requiring, not requiring, supporting learners to pay attention to how these parts are connected. The Handbook of Sustainability Literacy is not a brand new book. This is a few years old now, but as far as getting people to kind of providing the scaffolding for people to undergo a real shift in their thinking, this is what this book does well. The author talks about the different ways in which people can be encouraged to think about sustainability questions, and this is what interdisciplinary teaching should look like. Another one that I recommend for educators as well as for anyone who's trying to facilitate a conversation between and among groups that aren't necessarily all coming from the same place would be Kitchen Table Sustainability. The authors present a really kind of intriguing process that they call the EATING for education, action, trust, inclusion, nourishment, and governance. I won't try to summarize any of these books here, but I would say what I find them helpful for. This one is for convening conversations around sustainability that make sure that everyone, both literally and figuratively, has a place at the table. The next that I would recommend is actually a series of 4 books published by by Gaia Education, called The 4 Keys. There's one on economics, one on ecological habitats, one called Song of the Earth, which is about integrating the scientific and the spiritual, and Beyond You and Me, about building community. These I recommend for actually classroom lessons, as well as possibly workshops for professional development. They're not specifically targeted for higher education, but depending on what you're trying to use them for, I think they are appropriate for higher ed. This next resource, I think I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention it, by Peggy Barlett and Jeffrey Chase, about sustainability in higher education, stories and strategies for transformation. One of the participants earlier was talking about how hard it can be to engage people in this very, very big and yet very important task of developing interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary curricula on sustainability. And others of you were also interested in sustainability education that involves the physical environment, whether it's land or buildings. This book does a really good and careful job of presenting a variety of case studies in which people have kind of crossed those boundaries and realized that, for example, engaging environmental studies with residential life, for example. A much newer book is the Higher Ed in Sustainable Development book that talks about some of the drivers and the barriers to education for sustainability. Those of you who are interested in curriculum development will be most interested in this, and it does have a much stronger slant toward engineering education. So for those of you coming from the science and technical backgrounds, you'll find lots to love in this book. The other emphasis that I enjoy here is communities of practice, because I feel in terms of creating an inclusive community where people feel that they can reach out across the disciplinary boundaries, that this is the one place where that can happen. This This author also talks about the factors that both limit and drive education for sustainability. And I think that this also gets into how we talk about sustainability. We have these sort of mental maps about what that word means and what it actually looks like in practice, and that there can be a disconnect between the sciences and the humanities and the other fields, but also between what science says about what creates a sustainable system and what is actually practiced, not only in education but in industry. On the other hand, factors driving education for sustainable development include perhaps an increase in funding interest for sustainable development, so as well as increasing interest in conferences and declarations about the need for education for sustainability. Okay, so here I want to pause because Tom, I think that you had some other questions that have come in.
Hi, Jess. I was just about to share with you some of the recommended resources from some of the participants, which I've shared via the organizers chat. Otherwise, it'll be quite a long-winded statement by me, and you can pick the words that sort of best or concisely relay these recommendations. But a couple of questions that I see as well. Number one, are students directly involved in sustainability educations, that is, in terms of empowerment and involvement? And then secondly, have you reviewed the new book, quote, Pursuing Sustainability, A Guide to the Science and Practice, unquote, by Matson, Clark, and Anderson?
Okay, thanks, Tom. To answer the second question first, I actually haven't reviewed that book, but if the participant would have time to email that recommendation to us at the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium, I'd be happy to take a look. And I'll also take this opportunity to mention that our website does contain a small collection of resources. We're always interested in hearing from you what are the most interesting and useful to you in your sustainability education practice, and so if that is one that you'd like to recommend, please do go ahead and send it. And then the first question was about, I'm not sure that I got the very first part of the question. I remember that it was about empowering students and making sure that they have an active, involved role in education for sustainability, but I'm not sure if the participant is interested in where that's happening or in what ways that should happen, or wants to offer something from one of their models, or if there's any follow-up on that question, please go ahead and send it. In the meantime, I'll definitely mention some of these comments that Tom has shared in the chat box about resources posted by participants. The Bioneers Radio had a program on eco-literacy for higher ed with David Orr and Anthony Cortese. I don't know if either of you have had a chance to see those two educators speak. I have at some AASHE conferences and others, and I highly recommend if you do get a chance to either read or go and see them speak that you do so. The message says that the bottom line was to have education for sustainability be interdisciplinary and to involve the community. And I think that it should go without saying, but it definitely has to be said that involvement of the community in sustainability is pretty critical, right? Sustainability is about involvement and social justice and not just greening the campus. And so for EFS to not involve the entire community in its planning, delivery, and evaluation would be leaving an essential part of the equation out. Regarding climate change, this is a good point here too. Effective language and millennials, higher education specifically. There's a mention of the Eco America report that provides a summary of the research findings, which is at ecoamerica.org. And we can certainly provide some of these references at the end of the webinar. And then a couple other ones that I'll mention really quick here. The information on Otto Scharmer's Theory University, I think U is for university, can be found on the Presencing Institute website, which is a nonprofit, presencing.com. And then Cal Poly SLO had a program called the Sustain SLO. The SLO is SLO is San Luis Obispo, for freshmen to get oriented to sustainability to campus and their community. And there's a link for that at calpoly.edu. Okay. So I want to start to wrap up a little bit here. It's about 3:20 at this point, and then we'll also have one question from a participant that has been waiting that we'll get back to. So some reflection questions for sustainability educators. Unless, Tom, you wanted to jump in, or Ira?
Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
Okay, great. So reflection questions to take with you. And again, I really want to encourage you to do whatever kind of journaling you do, or if you don't do journaling, give it a try. You don't have to commit to years and years of journaling, but just try it out. Take some of these questions with you. See how many times you can identify a sustainability theme. Take it in the classroom, not the classroom, but see if you can pick up on a theme of sustainability that's not actually identified as such. Okay? Then notice if others are picking up on these themes too. You'd have to figure out how you're going to know that. Is it certain phrases they're using? Is it the follow-up questions that they ask? Is it who they share that information with? Is it what they decide to do with an idea? You have to figure out that for yourself, but see how many times you and your colleagues and people in your learning community can pick up on when sustainability is being talked about even though it's not being named. Next reflection question is, how can you find out if someone you're working with in your learning community, whether it's a colleague, a leader, a learner you know, places a different meaning or value or interpretation to some kind of sustainability related term. For example, one of the participants mentioned injustice, talking about injustice. People definitely have different ideas about what that means, what it includes, what it doesn't include. So I offer some examples to play with, and you may have your own examples. Environmental justice is mentioned there, ecological identity. Local food means different things to different people. Chemicals, corporate social responsibility. I'm sure that participants here can come up with other words that people describe or value or interpret differently. So see how many of those you can find. And then the third reflection question to take away is if you're developing an educational project, whether that's short-term or long-term, whether it's based in the classroom or based out in the community somewhere, this is the most important one for me. Take a look at what assumptions you have about what sustainability, what bells that rings for people. How they're perceiving it, how they're experiencing it, how they're talking about it. And dig deeper into, once you've actually identified what assumptions you have carrying around with you, how might those assumptions be a problem with talking with different audiences, or how it might actually spur discovery, how actually talking about the assumptions and the differences in those assumptions might actually spur you to connect with each other in a different way, or cause you to learn something. I mentioned feedback loops, so I'll just mention really briefly a way to build some feedback loops into your own educational practice, keeping some kind of a journal that might have reflection questions that I mentioned or reflection questions that you might come up with on your own. Creating pilot projects that are just sort of, let's see if this works, and doing some pre- and post-assessment, using as many collaborative opportunities with people from different disciplines as you can find. Doing participatory learning, community-based learning, service learning, anything that is focused on human health, wellness, food security, all those kinds of things that are not called sustainability, but that do encompass its ideas and its goals. Collaborative teaching, writing, and research is a great way to get feedback from colleagues outside of your sort of natural habitat wherever you live in your academic world. And that feedback is really important for developing your teaching, your writing, your research practice. Continuing the dialogue on, I have this in quotes, the sustainability lexicon. There have been many examples of folks trying to develop, a good, solid lexicon of definitions of what we mean by all these different sustainability terms. So learn more about that. And if you find resources that you want to either help develop or share among the higher ed community, please feel free to add those to ours, and you can check out what we've already got there based on some of your feedback on our website. And at SCC, and again you can find this on our website as well, we always want to know what are the biggest challenges you face as a sustainability educator, and what support do you most need in terms of faculty and curriculum development. And with that, I want to circle back to Ira and Tom on that last question.
Sure, thanks, Jess. The question is, I wonder if you or others have suggestions for co-teaching across interdisciplinary boundaries when the incentives given to teachers are college or department specific only, not across the university. In other words, getting teaching released to co-teach with others across campus in different departments and colleges can be very challenging because there is no infrastructure to reward departments and colleges for allowing faculty to do that and sustain that kind of cross-university collaboration for a course that lasts long-term, available for many semesters or years.
Yes, that is an it's a great question. I really, really, really like the question. The reason I like it so much is because it talks about the very foundations of kind of how we deliver higher education and how we who are involved in it kind of perceive what it is for. Because again, going back to language, how we think about something influences how we talk about it and vice versa. So we talk about interdisciplinary, right? That assumes that we have disciplines, we have these boxes, and we have to somehow work across them. Not get rid of the boxes, right? Nobody's suggesting that, we don't have an environmental science department and a biology department and an engineering department. We want to keep the boxes where they are, but just encourage everybody to step outside of their boxes and work together. And we don't necessarily have the infrastructure in order to do that. I mentioned a couple of times now the On Sustainability Knowledge Network in Portland. One of the examples that was mentioned in one of our discussions there was having a dual appointment so that an instructor could teach classes that were numbered in the environmental science or environmental studies department, as well as classes that were taught in the humanities or history department. And I've seen that in my role at Franklin Pierce as well. It still doesn't break down the boxes entirely, but it does make it so it's a little bit more manageable in terms of planning out what courses will be taught from year to year and by whom, and how to kind of integrate some of the projects that you can do when you have both historical, or I was going to say historical, but have both history expertise and environmental expertise, and you're able to craft things like place-based learning experiences. So a dual faculty role is one sort of solution, but more broadly than that, I think I would refer back to that article in Resilience Journal that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that talks more about addressing the kind of higher goals of higher education. and questioning, what is it really all about? Is it to continue adding content and adding specialization because we're so hyper-specialized already, or is it really about identifying the larger social and political problems for which higher education is uniquely suited to address? And some of that is going to involve knocking down some of those walls, and that can be kind of scary, especially if you are an administrator in charge of a budget and enrollment, and you want to offer topic X because topic X has shown 3,000% growth over the last 3 years, and you want to be able to keep your university faculty employed, so you're going to develop that program. So yeah, it can be scary and difficult, and I don't necessarily have a recipe for solving all of those. However, I think that having a mindful attitude about what we can solve together, as opposed to keeping sustainability as a niche topic within the environmental realm, is key. And again, just want to encourage you to continue reaching out toward one another and sharing those examples of the small and large successes so that people can continue building on one another's work. So with that, I think that I've gone just a little bit over time, but I want to once again express gratitude to Ira and Tom, as well as to all of you for participating in this. I think it's really great to see all of this interest, and I want to encourage you to continue providing your feedback as we continue offering more sessions in our webinar series. So thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Just to wrap up, reminder, the remaining 2 webinars in this series are on July 12th and July 19th. We will also have an online dialogue coming up next month that will include the planetary boundaries topic that was mentioned in the discussion today, that will be included in our dialogue on the 2030 development agenda. I want to also again thank AASHE for their co-sponsorship of the series, and thanks to Tom Bauman for fielding the questions today. Great job as always from Jess, and we will gather the various resources that have been mentioned, including the relatively new Mattson book, and place those on our resources page on the SCC website. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you next on July 12th. Bye-bye.